Faculty Spotlights focus on a technique an instructor uses to increase student engagement or on a particular learning objective. Professor George Hoffman explored several pedagogical techniques during his first semester teaching in a team-based learning classroom. We spoke with him and the support specialists he worked with. So welcome, Deb Meislich, George Hoffman, myself, I'm Carla Stelbrecht, and this is Phil Cameron. So to get started today, George, I'd just like to ask you, how did the course come to be taught this way? Tell us how it all came to be.
It grew out of some amount of panic on my part at being asked to teach a large section course as a language teacher. Our class sizes are limited to 18. I've taught courses up to 30, 35 here and at other institutions, but I had no experience with the amphitheater format. And in particular, I used a lot of group work, and I had no idea how to handle reporting out of group work in an amphitheater with any kind of grace or efficiency. And Philomena Meacham had mentioned the option of toggling monitors in the TBL rooms. And that seemed like a quick solution to my simple problem. And luckily, right after that, I ended up taking the large course initiative run by Deb and Whitney Peoples. And it was in that context, knowing that I was going to use that classroom, fortunately, there was a lot of talk about team-based learning, and I realized that team-based learning involved a lot more than toggling a monitor. And I jumped on it because we've been talking in my department about the social disconnect of our students. They come into the classroom with their phones, and at the end of the semester, they still don't know the names of people they sit right next to, even in a small classroom that involves a lot of personal discussion, like a language classroom. And that disturbed me, and we've known for some time the social connection is important for learning. And so then I thought, well, the team-based model brings a kind of a way to get them to make friends in the classroom and make the learning process social. And that was through the large course initiative workshops, I kind of jumped on the whole team-based thing and decided to go in whole hog.
Indeed. So another thing I'm curious about is how you introduced this experience to students, in particular things that you included in your syllabus or the way you utilized time on the first day. Can you talk a little bit about how you introduced them to this way of learning?
Well, it started before they came into the classroom because we used the CATME program, which I believe comes from engineering, to set up student teams. And I didn't use any of the pre-programmed questions. I built my own, which were kind of tongue-in-cheek references to Westworld. And the students emailed me messages after that saying they were really excited about the course because it made them remember seeing the television program. So they were kind of prompted by CATME a week before classes started to start thinking about the class. They were sorted into teams. One of the beauties of CATME is the machine does the sorting, so the GSI or the professor can't be blamed for who you ended up working with. I put a lot of material in the syllabus, but the more I go, the more I think that the syllabi are kind of holding places for our own ideas, for sharing ideas with colleagues. A lot of students don't look at syllabi anymore. So it was a way to kind of cue the GSIs in. I think some students looked at the syllabi, but I'm not sure that's ultimately the place to explain the team-based format. What we did do is we devoted a week and a half of the beginning of the semester to team activities, icebreakers in lecture, but also in section, and the drawing up of a team charter together. And that locked the teams in actually right away. The rest of the semester, the teams were good. We had no problems with the teams throughout the semester. Students came in engaged with the course because they were engaged with each other. When the course started, they weren't looking at their phones, they were talking to each other. And the social talk shifted perfectly into talk about papers, work, team activities, and things like that. So I have to say that, if anyone's worried about student engagement at this point in the 21st century, the team-based model just takes care of that, in my experience, flawlessly.
I'm curious about how much structure you gave to the teams for building the team charters.
Yeah.
So there were a set of prompts,
Okay.
and some team charters are bullet point responses to those prompts. Others are more woven in. But I used some of the models from the workshop and just kind of combined the ones I thought were relevant into the prompt. And that seemed to work fine.
Cool.
The charter was there to refer back to. If we needed to arbitrate, we didn't. So, but I think the process of writing the charter was in itself part of the process building. There was also team roles that I assigned, or had the students pick, but I pointed out to them that obviously the CAT-ME questions that created the diversified skill set in each team were fishing for particular comfort levels in visual design or organization or moderating between people. And I asked them to think about those responses when they picked their roles. And then I tried to conscientiously reference those roles, and when we would do group work and activities in the process of the lecture, and hopefully in sections too, I'd have specific pieces of the activity broken down by team role. The one mistake I made was they misunderstood the team note taker as a person who took notes in lecture for everybody. And that person worked very, very hard. It ended up being something I decided not just to go with because they had invested so much energy early on into it. But next time around, I'm going to make clear that everybody needs to take their own notes. The team note taker is the one who is kind of coordinating the different ideas when the team is working as a group.
Good to know.
And did they stick with those roles the whole time, or was there any rotation of roles? And it sounds like they were sort of meant to be specialized roles in the way you had envisioned it.
Yeah, and the teams were rock solid all semesters long. No one even hinted that they would like to change teams, although we had that option. I did at one point, somewhere halfway through the semester, say, okay, you've experienced your team role. If you want to rotate roles, that would be great. You don't have to, but it might be fun to try a different role, and I just let them decide. An obligatory rotation might have been a better idea. My sense is they more or less didn't change roles. They were kind of comfortable with where they were. So.
There was a peer review component, right, to the workings of the teams. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you had that set up and what your takeaways are from it?
Yeah, that was kind of the thing that convinced me that CAT-ME was worth the trouble in setting up the spreadsheet to load into the beginning to get the program to work. I'm not a spreadsheet person.
Nicole Tuttle, right, from CRLT, a
She
colleague of
pretty much
Deb's, really worked. Yeah. She knows it well.
She essentially did it for me. And I think, if you're not used to spreadsheets, you definitely need outside help because it's very finicky in how you load your student information in. Every comma has to be exactly in the right place. So that was a super big help, thanks to Nicole. But it was worth the trouble because not only did CAT-ME place everybody into teams impersonally, so no one could be blamed for the outcome, but it administers a peer evaluation that is itself robust and has a practice routine built into the beginning of it that coaches students on how to be thoughtful in peer evaluation. I guess we were all expecting there would be more complaining, more personality issues than there were. And in fact, what we mostly got back was an immense amount of gratitude for fellow team members, an appreciation of one another. And it actually made me regret that we had told people that we would keep their evaluation confidential, because I wanted to share it.
Right. That's
But it was nice for us to see, and it was, there were a couple of personality conflicts that had happened early on in the semester. I think they were mostly resolved by the time we did a third of the way through the semester. We did the peer evaluation, but they were still good to flag and to double check that things were going better. One thing that did emerge from the peer evaluations is that this is a first-year writing requirement course, so it's writing intensive. Writing is generally an individualistic activity, and I had wanted, since it's a big part of the grade component, I wanted team writing to feature into the writing, to lock in the importance of the team-based approach into the biggest component of the grade. My mistake was I led with a team-authored introduction, and that because they had not received any feedback on writing that was involving a grade, they were extremely anxious to have their first grade be shared with their team. So the lesson I learned is I'm going to reverse the first two exercises. Their first writing assignment will be an individual writing assignment.
Okay.
They'll go through the process of looking at how they were graded, checking against the rubric, and then I think they'll be a little bit more confident that they can collaborate for the second assignment on a team-graded introduction to their team portfolio.
That makes sense. Maybe this is a good time to talk a little bit about that collection of assignments and how you structured it. I think there were 7 parts to it.
Yeah. Well, the whole course is trying to leverage the Westworld TV show, all this tech, and all the various things we've talked about and are going to talk about this afternoon, in the name of some very old skills, slow reading and slow writing, and in particular, something I've been concerned about over the years in our well-placed and well-meaning attempt to be transparent about our expectations with students and to be more inclusive in our teaching. We work harder to break our assignments down. We work harder to scaffold them. We provide rubrics. But that inadvertently creates a mindset in students where it's a check the box. I've done this part. I don't have to think about it again. I've done this part. I can check it off. Go on. And so I wanted to have everything that we did not be a check the box I don't have to think about again, but something I will come back to and continue to incorporate into my thinking, reading, and writing as I move forward in the semester. So that's why all the writing assignments were related as steps in a sequence, and why not only did they have to revise them in and of the moment as one has to do in a first-year writing requirement course, but they were all pulled together at the end into the WordPress portfolios.
Right.
And in the name of the other half of that, the slow reading, each team wrote all semester on just one reading, their team reading. We all, as a group, eventually would get to each of the readings, but they jumped out in front of the class as a whole and commented those readings using the perusal program that we'll talk about in a minute. And so they had an early buy into the reading, and then everything they wrote from thereafter was about those 20 pages, 25 pages of reading, again, to get them to go back over and over again to the reading, to think about it, to keep mining it for new ideas. So it was a bunch of steps that I used a rubric for the first time. There was some scaffolding. Next year I'm going to use sample papers because I can do that now that I've been through it once, to calm student anxiety about what the professor is looking for.
Yeah.
But my aim all through this has been to continue to go back and think about what I've already read in the mind of the student, what I've already written, how I can keep going back and forth between those and slow my process down so that I can keep asking new questions throughout the semester instead of thinking I've finished that part of the semester and I'm done with it.
On to the next.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about perusal? Any thoughts, just in terms of ease of use for you, for the students? How easy was it to integrate? You integrated a lot of moving parts in this course, and so how was it as one of those moving parts to work with?
Perusal's a terrific program that I would unconditionally recommend to anybody that has reading assignments in their course. It's deceptively simple. All it is a way for students to socially comment a PDF. And that doesn't sound like much, but what it does is it kind of allows you to have a kind of a low stakes assessment of reading before students get to course. So that's already very useful for us. It allows the students to interact, so it was part of their early team building activities that they would interact around this reading before it had been talked about, sometimes months before it was talked about in course, and relate it to Westworld, and see how one another thought through the comments. It allows me as a professor and the GSIs as instructors to go in and see where the points of access and traction are in the reading, where the misunderstandings are, where the students themselves are realizing that they don't understand something about the reading. So it flags all of that. And then the nice extra payoff in Perusal is that it uses AI to assign a grade. So it was folding in the theme of the course.
It was so perfect for the course. It really was.
There are two issues in Perusal. One is you can't put it in your navigation bar.
Right.
Otherwise, it won't feed the grade directly into Canvas. It has to come from a Canvas assignment.
Yeah.
And second, it's not set up to be assigned to Canvas teams. So once you have your Canvas teams, you have to hand assign the readings to the teams. What it does have, if everybody is doing the reading at the same time, as in most other cases, most other courses would be the case, it can automatically break students into smaller groups so that you don't have 120 people commenting all over the place on a 20-page reading. But it can't do that in relationship to teams you have on Canvas.
Yeah. Any thoughts about the Canvas groups while we're on that topic? I know. I think that's going to be a big point of curiosity for people is, and I saw you use them, quite a bit, but I know there are some, things that we hope will be improved. For instance, you can make a home page, but you can make a page on that individual group site, but they can't designate it as their group's home, landing page, front page. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about, would you use them again?
I'd use them again as a kind of a storage place for student work. That's that's their main functionality. The other thing that I discovered that was handy about Canvas groups is for team assignments, I could give feedback via an announcement to the Canvas team on that Canvas team page, and that would automatically go to the GSI, and the GSI has found that very helpful. So that works out well, and it does facilitate, once you figure out how to use it, it does facilitate team grading. It's a little bit clunky because you have to remember who's in what Canvas team, so you have to have a couple windows open. That functionality could definitely be improved, but it's there. One of the big disappointments for me was when students working on a team exercise open up a new page in their Canvas team site, they can't co-edit it. It's limited to the only person who can edit that page is the first person who opened it.
Wow.
So you have to go out to Google Docs to do something collaborative and then re-import it back in. It just seems like that's
the workflow is a little
not
inelegant. Maybe.
Yeah, and that just seemed like if you've got a team page, wouldn't you want a team site? Wouldn't you want team pages that team members could simultaneously co-edit?
Right.
That just seems like a big
Right.
blind site to me.
Yeah.
It's it's about 50% useful. It's about half the way there.
That's good to know. Okay, that's halfway there. Yeah.
What were student perceptions of it like?
Yeah.
Obviously, they were annoyed that only one person could edit a page. But
Yeah, I mean they were they're all familiar with Google Docs, so they were, and I know you teach a lot about how to go back and forth between Canvas and Google Docs. So I think they quickly found their workarounds. It could be so much more. It was worth the effort of setting them up, but only somewhat so. I don't think they were terribly annoyed by their Canvas page, but I don't think it wouldn't be enough to lock in a team dynamic without all the other things we did.
right.
Good to know. Yeah.
So, George, you talked about the ways in which you use teams in a few places here. So the initial assigning them to teams, the initial activities to get them used to being teams. Can you talk just a little bit about sort of the way that those teams worked across the course? So what were you hoping having those teams do? So some of it was team writing, but I just wonder if you could kind of lay out sort of what the different pieces of that teamwork looked like across the course of the term.
Yeah, I want to backtrack just a tiny bit from your question to say something that I think is important. I got into team-based learning as a way out of an original desire to handle group work in a large course format. I now think that group work and team-based learning are very, very different beasts. In particular,
Say more about that.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
but I think in a lot of people's mind, team-based learning. Well, I do group work. I already do that.
Yeah.
Got it.
But as you know, best practice for group work involves changing members of groups regularly, so people don't always work with the people they're sitting next to. Team-based is exactly the opposite. You lock in those people for half the semester, in my case the whole semester. Group work, it's essential to pretty much most, or if not all, classes we teach, but you can have a fantastic group work exercise on Wednesday, and it means nothing about what's going to happen when you do group work on Friday. It's all or miss in however well you structure it that individual day and what everybody's mood is that day. The team-based approach, even though it seems more locked in maybe, and therefore possibly more inert than on-the-fly group activities, in fact what it does is it allows you to build upon past successes. So every time they have a good experience in a team, they come back more excited, more willing to work in the next. And you build throughout the semester, and you never get any of that, I found, in group activities. So that's a kind of a fundamental difference in the two approaches that I discovered as I kind of went through it.
I
I
think
just
that's
wanted,
really useful to lay that out. And I mean, even sort of thinking about it there's, I think, a full-blown continuum here. And sort of also thinking about where you want to be on that continuum, too.
Yeah. I mean, some of the things I wanted out of team activity were very, very simple for students, particularly freshmen, not to feel anonymous on campus. We all remember from our own education, it's not that easy to meet people in classrooms. It's even more difficult when you walk into a classroom and everybody's zoned out on a phone. So I wanted people to make friends because living learning communities and all sorts of research shows that even in the humanities, collaborative work, or at least social study, is really important. And that was fantastic to watch happen. So I've told this story before, but in 1 week, On 2 separate occasions, students walked in with untreated broken wrists to lecture. And in one case, myself in a GSI, in another case, just the GSI said, well, shouldn't you go to UHS and have this looked at and x-rayed? And in both cases, the students said, I don't want to miss class. I don't want to let my team down. I'll do that afterwards.
Wow.
By the end of the semester, we had a couple people that I think were probably dating in their team. So the social component really worked.
Yeah.
But you could just see that people would come into class and they'd immediately start talking and engaging with one another. And when we moved to team activities in the lecture room, people immediately started talking. There was no kind of silence as people tried to wait for someone else to talk and who's going to be the first. And none of that happened. And I could barely get people to shut up again when I needed to pull everything together and wrap up. So that part kind of suggested that students are hungry for this, even if maybe they don't realize it, that they want that kind of connection. They don't want it to all be in their dorms, and maybe it doesn't even happen as well as they want in their dorms. Some of the activities we did were so besides writing activities and a lot of the peer editing and the workshopping that happened in section was team-based. But there was also a string of visual exercises. I wanted to work a little bit on visual literacy because we were going to have this WordPress portfolio, team portfolio that was going to be illustrated. So we started a set of illustrations in class around the team. Another thing I did, picking up from the large course initiative, was scratch cards. Most of my students didn't know how to use them, and I felt a little bit guilty that maybe I'd introduced a few to the whole concept of playing lotto. So those scratch card quizzes were different from the Canvas reading quizzes in that they asked students to relate different readings, to warm them up and thinking about how they would place the different readings together. And one of the things I want to do more of next semester is then immediately follow those up with a writing assignment. How would you use some of these relations between other authors that you're not writing on, that are not your team author? How would you write on them? How would you take that relation and say something about it around your team reading and your own writing?
Right. So those were group quizzes that they did in class, just to fill in the gaps here, using the sort of scratch card where they were actually having to fill in and come to an individual or a team answer for them. Yeah. So that was the system. Were they doing that individually first and then the team, or was it only a team-based quiz?
I think the first quiz was a team-based quiz, and then I used that to introduce the whole quiz format. Then they would start. They had a weekly Canvas quiz, individual quiz, and then every 2 weeks they have a team quiz in lecture.
In the class.
Yeah. So those were some activities. Some were just discussion questions that were kind of maybe application more challenging. So we've talked about the reading. We've talked about some of the more counterintuitive takeaway points of the reading and lecture. How would you apply that to this scene in Westworld? Start talking in your teams. You can finish up in section later this week. That was a pretty typical kind of sequence from lecture to section. One thing that I discovered from Nicole, I believe it was she who suggested this, and I wished I'd thought about it early, was another way to handle reporting out of group work in teams would be to have the teams report to their GSI in the lecture. And that's something I want to try first week, to start to facilitate the connection between the teams and their GSI on the first day, so that they walk into the section already knowing each other.
So George, can I have you talk a little bit about the connections between things that you did in lecture and discussion, those probing questions?
So one of the things that I did early on, given that there was going to be so much work, workshopping and peer review of writing in sections, I wanted the teams to map onto the sections. Each section has 3 teams. The GSI has all the members of each team in their section so that they can be fully functional. On this campus, with our student schedules, I didn't want to count on students being able to find time to meet outside of class.
Yeah.
And we can talk more about flipped classrooms, but it kind of forced my hand in being aggressive about flipping the classroom, was we had to open up so much team time for them in lecture and section. So that was a reason to have the 3 teams be mapped onto the section. And then in talking with people, one of the many ideas I got from you all and from people who are not here in consulting was that those 3 teams, there would be value to placing those 3 teams in a cluster in the lecture room so that their GSI could be strategically in the middle of those 3 teams, talk with their team members, and an idea I got from Nicole that I want to be sure to use at the beginning of the semester next year is that if you've got your teams all in a cluster around 3 tables that are in a triangle and you've got your GSI, you can handle reporting out of team activities by having them turn and share in turns with their GSI, which is a way for every team then to have a better chance of reporting out within the 50-minute lecture time than if I'm just going to flip monitors. When I did flip the monitors and look at them all together, at most I could get to about 4 teams. So what I want to do is have that activity of reporting out to your GSI to happen in the very first day of class, the first lecture, so that they know their GSI and they've gotten comfortable talking about what they're doing to their GSI, and the GSI has gotten comfortable playing a kind of a public role in front of them before they even go into their first section meeting.
Right. Yeah. Can I ask a detailed question? You had name tags, am I correct? You used name tags. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you feel that helped, or was it not important? I just had a discussion with someone who also teaches in that same space, and she did not use name tags, and she didn't find that there was as much connection. Now, I think it had to do with a lot of other factors, but she says name tags are a must. Do you feel, probably not as you went, but initially, just to make sure that they knew each other's names?
Yeah.
Was it worth it, I think?
It was definitely worth it for me because I'm not good at remembering names, period.
Right.
And it allowed me to use first names in the lecture. In fact, I'd say one of the things that I realized about a third of the way through the semester was the TBL model is not incompatible with just traditional classroom activities of stopping and having a mini conversation back and forth with a single student, and then turning to another individual student saying, well, what do you just think about what we said? And for some reason, I felt like the first 3 or 4 weeks I couldn't do that. And then when I did start doing just kind of my normal classroom behavior, it seemed to open up a lot of flow in the lecture that the GSIs and everybody seemed to be responsive to. And I needed the name tags to do that because I couldn't possibly remember 80 names. Since I was going to the expense and trouble of printing out these name tags, they're little
They
tents.
were just tents,
So
right?
table
Laminated
tents.
tents,
Yeah.
Right.
So I said to the GSIs, this is what I decided to do. Why don't you be responsible for distributing them and collecting them after each lecture? Because if we send them off with the students, they're going to disappear.
Right.
And this could be your tool for keeping attendance. Since giving a participation grade was part of their responsibility.
Makes sense, yeah. Good.
And then it's already there for them. So then they've got their name tags when the GSI goes into their section later that afternoon, or or the next day they put up the tents in their smaller room, and it's a continuity from the lecture. They see the same typeface, the same names, and presumably it helps them learn their student names. I needed those name tags all through the semester. I'm sure they didn't after a few weeks, and I'm sure they only were used in lecture after about week 3. But for me, they were kind of a kind of analog technology that was essential.
Yep. Did you want to talk any more about the team portfolios and the use of WordPress? The things I'm curious about are things like, did it seem fairly easy for them to do without a lot of prep or outside work? Was it as much work as you anticipated it being, both for you and for the students? And did it seem to be sort of a meaningful semester project?
I think it was a meaningful semester project. It's one that I think I will hone in on more, or home in on more next time. It's easy to do if you do have you come and do the workshop.
Right. Okay, good. Well, that's
because
good to
as
know.
we
That
saw,
helped. That was worth it. Okay.
Yeah,
good.
there was a number of technical issues and questions that came up during that workshop.
Yeah.
The workshop was effective. I didn't have to. There were no follow-up questions afterwards. That hour seemed to be enough for them to get familiar with WordPress, so that they could use it as the final finishing spot for all their writing.
Right.
The mistake I made in that was that I left the Submit by Canvas option open for that last step. So a number of students submitted directly on that, as well as to their WordPress thing, and a number of GSIs graded on Canvas. And now I realize I need to close that option down.
Interesting, right?
So that everybody in the semester has to go to the WordPress site.
Got it.
The students have to put their material on there. That's the only way they can submit it.
Got it. Okay.
The GSIs have to look at it all, because that's the only way they can grade it.
Okay.
And I have to look at it,
Right.
because that's the only way I can see, all right, did this whole thing come together and work? What are some of the highlights?
Okay. Okay.
It was a little bit too leaky in the way that I left that alternative
Interesting.
function open. So I'm going to be more authoritarian that way around WordPress. But WordPress, I think it was worth the investment of a class time, because it also allowed me to kind of overcome one of the stumbling blocks of the course, which was, how do you run a team-based course in a first-year writing requirement course, where so much of the writing is going to be individual?
Right.
So by having a team introduction and a team conclusion where they write an individual paragraph and then they share it, and then they pull it all together into a team introduction on what is the connection between Westworld and their reading, team conclusion, what are our combined takeaway points, and where do they lead us next. That allowed a kind of a team framework to go around the individual chapters of within it
Of work, yeah.
And then one of the, besides just doing visual literacy, which I think is important in and of itself, one of the ways we tried to lock in the importance of the WordPress portfolio, besides it being public. I mean, they understand just because it's on the web doesn't mean anybody's necessarily going to find their way to it. Was that we had a gallery walkthrough.
Right.
The last day of class, which was kind of a fun ceremonial thing to do.
Yeah.
We used iClicker Cloud to vote the top 2 sites, which were mostly design visual votes. I then also let the GSIs walk through and give a jury prize. And I also, in the background, added a couple extra points to a few teams I thought got overlooked, but it was kind of a fun sharing exercise where everybody was presenting, and one team member would stay back and present and scroll through their WordPress portfolio. Everybody else would circulate and look at what other people had done, and that was a fun way to kind of lock in the value of the WordPress portfolio, and the fact that there was a team envelope around the individual writing.
Yeah, yeah.
And it sounds like another way to really leverage the space that you were in.
Yeah.
Because being able to do something like that, the space certainly facilitated the ability to do that kind of activity as a sort of
Yes.
culminating activity at the end.
Right, right. There would, I guess, in a smaller classroom, you could have people with their laptops. It wouldn't be impossible, but it was perfect for that space. And without that space, we wouldn't have had near as much fun. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you given any thought to other ways that you might leverage previous semester portfolio sites?
I haven't till now, but yes, I can direct people to those portfolios so they can see what the previous year did. Thank you.
Sorry, off the cuff question. My first thought was that it'd be a great place to pull. You said that this semester you wanted to leverage example essays.
Right.
And so maybe not the whole thing right off the bat, but certainly.
An easy way to make that available.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the problems, and I talked a little bit about it to some of you, one of the problems I encountered early on and consistently through the course reflected the high-achieving, anxious mindset of this public of students, which are honors program students, 60% of which were pre-med students. So these are students that are putting themselves under a lot of pressure, and therefore willing to pour a lot of anxiety into what is the professor looking for kinds of questions. And I found that the more we tried to explain the writing prompts, the more they started asking questions about them. And I had a number of GSIs who tried their own hand at explaining the prompt in their own words, thinking that they communicate more directly, and they ended up changing the prompt and misunderstanding it. So one of the things I want to really focus on next year is not spending time fussing over the prompt. What does the professor really want to see? Part of that is to be able to say, just go look at the sample papers, some of the outstanding papers from last year. That I think that having that model really puts students' minds to rest. The other thing I want to do is go through and talk through the writing assignment, the fact that the writing assignments are all going to build on each other, that there is going to be a portfolio coming down the line, and anchor that in students' minds with a screencast, and just offload it from the lecture. I think the time in lecture is already at a premium, and I want to open up more time for teamwork in lectures. So I'm taking a screencast workshop in a few weeks, and I'm just going to pour that in so that if they have problems, they can just come back to me, and I can take the three-way communication with the GSIs out of it. And if they don't understand my screencast, they're always welcome. I'll put it in. You're always welcome to email me. But the message being, just start writing, just go back and reread. If you have to, look at a sample paper, but just do it. Don't worry about what you think the prompt could possibly mean and how many different ways you can construe it. Just jump into the pool.
Did you want to talk at all about the process you used for having the teams create potential quiz questions?
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. That was one of the rare ideas that came out of the LCI, the large course initiative workshop, that ended up not working for me.
Interesting.
The idea was crowdsourcing questions. And I thought it would be an additional team building activity, so after they write their team charter, they go and look at their team reading before the rest of the class. They use perusal to comment on it. Then they work together in section as a team to come up with 12 potential quiz questions that then I fold into the Canvas individual quiz. And I've never used multiple choice questions. It's just not part of what a lot of humanities teachers like myself do. Unfortunately, an automatic online graded quiz, you kind of have to use multiple choice questions. They're the best bang for your buck. That and true false, essentially. So I realize they're incredibly difficult to write.
Yeah.
And
so is that where it fell apart? Was the sort of the quality of whether the questions were actually usable or not?
yeah, not many were usable. In
Yeah.
fact, the ones I did use ended up causing some of the greatest problems and confusion in the students' minds. So what I realized was, for another kind of course that uses maybe lower stakes questions, easier questions, or different kinds of questions, crowdsourcing quiz questions, exam questions could work like a dream. But my questions were kind of going at the big takeaways, the hard takeaways from the reading, and I don't really want to surrender that approach to the quizzes, but that was too difficult an exercise. It was really, frankly, it felt like it was too difficult for me many weeks to write a quiz that wasn't full of ambiguities. So what I did take away from the workshop was have an appeal process. I used that for the very first team quiz with the scratch card, and it taught me that there's a lot of potential ways my questions can be misunderstood. So I kept that appeal process all semester long, and it helped me improve the quizzes sometimes early enough in the process that it helped students who were later to the quiz, but certainly it's going to help for next year's students. And I'm going to keep the appeal process because it's really hard to write a challenging multiple choice question on a difficult reading that is not free from ambiguity or misconstrual. So I think that, just as a matter of fairness, given how high end the activity ended up being in my class, I need to keep the appeals process. But what I decided to do is take out that component and add in 2 more team quizzes, because I felt like that was fun and useful work for the students to do in the lecture.
That makes a lot of sense. Oh, and I think that the experience of what you're seeing in terms of helping students develop even slow reading skills and the ability to really wrestle with those texts, that those skills are really necessary to have fully developed to be able to even write a good question too. So you're seeing the sort of interplay with all of that in terms of what level you need to be at to be able to do that in the way that you wanted and needed it to be done.
Yeah.
So.
One of the things I tried to do, and I don't think I was very successful at, but that I learned from your presentations and Whitney's presentations was we can't assume our students are very reflective about their own learning process. In fact, they probably are mistaken about their own learning process. So metacognitive, addressing metacognitive issues is useful, particularly in a class of freshmen, but probably at all levels of education. Unfortunately, I think I did that mostly through lecturing and advice giving, and so I did it in a very unreflective way. Just dumping it in the syllabus or talking about it. What I did do, which I think was semi-fun and worked a little bit, was I presented myself as one of the hosts in Westworld who had cornerstone memories, which involved my wife and children. And my son was away as a freshman at the University of Oregon last fall. So I used some of his texts and some of his pictures from and some of his struggles as a freshman at Oregon, and brought that into class and framed my metacognitive advice around him, who became kind of a mini character in the course. And they liked that. I tried to do it with my daughter, and that kind of fell flat. So I realized that just personalizing you have to be very strategic when you personalize yourself in a course room. I think I will continue to use him as a kind of a proper character in the class. But one of the things I want to think about is how to address metacognitive issues in a more interactive way, and not in a kind of a dumb, here, let me tell you about how you should learn kind of way. I tried to ask them to reflect about their reading and around quiz, and then we would talk about it after the quiz. Did their reading strategy help them in the quiz or hurt them? But I think there was a little bit too much. I would have to admit in front of my peers that I messed up on the quiz for that, and there was a lot of inhibition around that. So that ended up not being the right way to do it. But there's a lot of. I probably need a few more consultation.
Always happy to talk, especially talk metacognition.
Yeah, I mean, I'm committed to that being important, but I need to think better about delivery vehicles, because I reverted back into, here, let me tell you about it, and that kind of mode. I realized even at the moment that I wasn't mirroring what I was saying. But it's when we're just like students. When we're confronted with a new task, a new learning, we revert to our oldest coping mechanisms.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
George, do you want to talk a little bit about what it was like to teach with a tablet? You used a tablet. It was a very media-rich course. So what was that experience like?
That was one of the things that worked better than I was expecting. There were some hitches because we were connecting, so I ran my entire keynote PowerPoint off of an iPad. And I did it because I felt like, particularly in this room, I had to move throughout the room. I've seen some people in amphitheaters move up a row or two. And I think the amphitheater, because there is a shared focus center, actually those people in the back were keeping pretty good tabs about what was going around the center. But the TBL rooms, there is no real center, and there's lots of blind spots, so you have to move. So I couldn't keep running up to move my lecture forward on the PowerPoint up at the podium. We were streaming high def footage from the television show from within the PowerPoint. So I think we tried 2, maybe 3 different consoles, and ended up settling on something that was sometimes had a little bit of a lag time, but didn't disconnect so easily and have to be rebooted so often. So those were kind of some of the issues. And if you're going to use a tablet in a TBL room and run your lecture off of it, you definitely want a tech person there at the beginning, because the consoles would typically need to be rebooted at the beginning of each class. That said, the thing that the tablet can really do, and that I only started to exploit a little bit, but I want to do more of, is you can use a stylus to mark up your PowerPoints in the middle of the lecture. You can't save your you can't save to PDF your lecture with those markups. They're ephemeral. But it allows you to take a PowerPoint, which I think allows you to pack in a lot of material very efficiently, and make it more interactive, because you can cross it out, you can add stuff to reflect student input, and you can also program in blank black slides that you can then say, okay, now tell me what you got, and then you can record it up like you would at a chalkboard in the process of your lecture that uses the big projection screens. So there's lots of fun things you can do with it, beyond the fact that it allows you to be mobile in those classrooms where you really need to move to those far corners with those tables that are in areas that it's going to be easy for those students to disconnect and start doing social media on their phone underneath the table. And you want to be looking over their shoulder and getting them to flick back to the course material.
So George, can you talk a little bit about the process of working with your GSIs and helping them feel comfortable with this and learning along with them? What was that process like for them as well as for you?
So I did a lot of things all at once for the first time. I don't necessarily recommend doing everything you learn about in the large course initiative and everybody you talk to, but I'd never directly overseen GSIs before. So, because of the small course format of my teaching. And there was a lot of things I realized I needed to be much more directive and clear about, and and I am already. I'm interviewing GSIs for next year and laying a lot of stuff on the table out right from the beginning, and saying this is the way it is. Take it or leave it.
Yeah, no, right.
I think the team-based format is essentially a gift for the GSIs, in that it delivers students ready to work in cohesive groups to them, even in the absence of much knowledge about how to structure group activities.
Right.
So it was a gift. It was a gimme for the GSIs. That said, the GSIs were as confused as I was about Canvas. So they didn't realize, and I didn't know they didn't realize, that they could go in and look at all the quiz questions and see what the different right and wrong answers were before they taught. So they were often very confused by the quiz questions themselves.
Oh, yeah.
And when I showed them, well, you guys can just go in before a section and look at this. Like, they said, oh my God, this is a game changer.
Wow.
But I didn't realize they didn't know that about. So there's, I was struggling with Canvas, but they knew even less about Canvas than I did, as it turned out. As you saw when you visited, it was a kind of a constant struggle to get the GSIs to play the role I wanted them to play in the lecture. I asked them to be seated strategically between their teams, and to basically help with handing off the mics.
Yeah.
Then to circulate and help their team, but they often pulled back to the periphery and used the time to prepare their section, to look at ideas I was talking about and type in stuff they were going to do in section.
Interesting.
So they weren't present all the times, and particularly when I'd say, all right, let's talk Mike, and I look around, can we get a mic to this table? And often I would have to do it myself because that's something that I need to work with more conscientiously. I think, like I said, starting with having teamwork being reported out to the GSIs right in the very first day of class will be one way of cueing them under the fact that they're on call in the lecture. This isn't a time for them to do class prep. This is something they need to be publicly.
It's interesting that you talk about that, because I think it was something that we realized in terms of supporting the room, that we were asking very unusual things of the GSIs, that we needed to be more intentional about offering forums where they could come to an understanding of what it was going to be like. So partly inspired by your experience, but your experience wasn't alone. I mean, it's a very different situation for a GSI to be in. We now have a 2-hour session that we offer at the beginning of the term for full instructional teams. So, which we've just gotten really positive responses to. So really, all the lessons learned that we've gathered, to sort of share that with them and enable instructors to work with their teams to do some role playing. Let's wrap our head around what this is really going to be like, and concerns about the equipment and just all of that stuff. Just get it all out of the way, and those have really been. We wished we had done it sooner. We weren't sure that it was necessary, but it's an hour and a half to 2 hours really well spent. So
I definitely
thank your instructional team for kind of going through that to help us realize that they needed a space to do that in.
Yeah, I shared with the GSIs before the semester started, here are your teams, here are the tables they're going to be seated at, so they'll be you'll be able to be close to all of your teams. And then, when everybody showed up the first day of class, I was panicked about, the console needing to be rebooted and this and that up front. And then I overheard the GSI saying, "Oh, go sit at any table. Doesn't make any difference where you sit." So I think we really need to be in that room.
Right.
This is gonna be your position
Exactly.
here. You're gonna have this microphone. Your teams are gonna be at these 3 tables.
Yep.
So
Yep.
come in and sit
Yeah.
there and pull.
Yep.
Have a little sign saying, section 42 over here.
Right.
Whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that they will feel much more prepared and not as thrown off by the dynamics of it. Am I supposed to be like walking around? They are, but you can see where they would be like, no, I'm not supposed to be doing that.
Yeah.
It's a whole different dynamic in there. So,
Yeah.
So, maybe wrapping up, getting to the end here with your thoughts about grading, assessment. You've talked, as we've been talking about different topics, but any final comments on what that process was like that you haven't already touched on?
I think the idea of having to share a grade with team members and having your grade potentially be anchored
Yeah.
to potentially the work by the weakest member
Yeah.
was hard for these students. Again, they're A+ students who are pre-meds. It's not enough for these students to make 98 out of 100. They want the 100. If there's 102 possible points, they want 102 points.
Yeah.
Putting the team grades a little bit later, I think, will be a good correction. I think it's going to remain, particularly for this audience of students, it's going to remain tricky, but one of the things I put in my syllabus and that I talked to GSIs about, and I need to put into the screencast and maybe talk about even more in lecture, is that's what working in a team involves. It involves getting over that fear of surrendering a little bit of control over the final product, and also opening yourself up to the idea that maybe a member of your team is actually going to have a key insight down the road that you would never have got to on your own. So that's something I probably will try to address more specifically, particularly before that first substantial grade comes with the team introduction, third week or so in the semester. That said, the problem really was only in the first grade. After that, when we did team graded things, they were just fine afterwards. A couple of teams would a number of teams bombed the team quiz. They would depute somebody in their teams to go and appeal to me, and that person would come back saying, "Professor Hoffman gave us credit for this, this, and this. That's good." And they'd have a kind of a hero's homecoming.
I'd be very curious if and there's no real way to tell this, but how the person was deputized into having that role.
Right.
Maybe they all, because I know that you assigned team members roles. I'd be curious to see if there's a correlation between who came and chatted with you about bombing a quiz and what role they had.
I think at one point I actually said use your moderator, because I realized that the team moderator had been underused. I said task for the team moderator.
Interesting.
In the end, the teams worked so organically. I'm not even sure you need team roles necessarily. It was a way to prompt a division of labor. It was a way to circulate work to make sure different people had different moments of being the central person, or the point person for an activity. But
I would say it's for exactly those reasons that you do need the roles.
Well, maybe, but my experience was that they jumped in pretty quickly, and they quickly, even without the roles, they seemed to intuitively understand that by the time of the peer evaluation, say, in a third of the way through the semester, that some of those quieter members who weren't the first to jump into talking actually had some of the most valuable insights, and they were very appreciative of that. I guess if it doesn't happen organically, it's nice to have those roles to kind of pump feed it a little bit, but I felt like the whole team thing worked so well and so organically that I might have gotten away without doing the roles. You maybe you're right. There might have been a
Interesting.
couple sticking spots where I needed them, but
I would say that Academy does a good job of creating teams naturally. So
well, and it does it as a machine. So we had no complaints about why was I put in this team. You know, you couldn't blame us.
Well, and they saw the information that you were asking from them that then
Right.
went into how the
Right.
teams themselves were being
Right.
created.
Right.
They
we're
saw
gonna-
what the, what they had what their answers to the survey was, or what the survey questions had been in the first place.
This is going to be an attempt to try to leverage a diverse skill set rather
Right.
than each one of you trying to doing it all yourself.
Right,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
In general, any thoughts about what you think the student experience was from what you picked up from them? How do you think they, at the beginning and then by the end, it sounds like they made strong connections with their teammates?
I think that the team work, the team-based model worked wonderfully, and they loved it. The things that didn't work were attaching difficult philosophical readings to a television show.
Interesting.
I mean, it worked in the moment, but there was the inevitable moment of disappointment, like, oh, this class is going to be about reading Descartes.
Interesting. Got it.
I actually loosened up and realized as long as they're thinking about the core concepts in such creative ways, they can write more about Westworld than about Descartes. I made myself more flexible as I saw what they were doing with the TV program. But I think, even with the description being heavily tilted towards philosophy and conceptual takeaways, for a lot of them it was like, oh, this really isn't about watching Westworld, is it? Well, that's, that's part of the bait and switch of higher education. I think the negative experiences, which from my final evaluations did definitively sour a certain small subset of students, had to do about the quiz questions being difficult and Canvas being inflexible in its grading scale.
Interesting.
So, like I will say, if you have a five question multiple choice quiz, if a student misses one question, they're at a B minus. If they miss two, they're at a D minus. And you can't modify that in Canvas until our colleague Anthony King suggested using a counterintuitive thing where an easy upfront gimme question is worth 88 points right up, so they start with a B plus. Higher than they would have if they'd missed one question, and then they've got multiple pass. Then the harder the questions get, the less points they're worth, and it's easier to get into the AA plus range with the appeal process that allows them ultimately all to get into the A range. That in the extreme amount of anxiety around the paper prompts.
Interesting.
I think that we all kind of expended a lot of emotional energy, me in trying to clarify things with GSIs, individual students, and in lecture, the GSIs with students and students with each other. So I'm hoping the screencast, being more directive with the GSIs, not to model confusion about the paper, not to indulge into fine point combing through different ways the professor might mean this term in the prompt. I think if I address those more proactively early on, I'm hoping that's going to remove most of that. I think just having sample papers up is a quick way we all have saying, just go look at a sample paper.
Yeah.
Don't bug us anymore.
Yeah. Relieves anxiety.
Yeah.
Here's a C paper, here's an A paper.
Yeah.
So, none of the problems came from the team-based format.
Interesting.
And ultimately, none of them came from the fairly regular technical glitches that we had in that room
Really?
as we were piloting its maiden
exactly.
semester of
Yeah.
voyage. They all came from things that were very new pedagogically to me, and I had not really thought through very well. plus some limitations in Canvas, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, George, I know you've done a lot of thinking about this course in community with others, but I wanted to go back to your participation in the LS&A CRLT Large Course Initiative and just sort of ask a little bit about what ways participation in that with a community of faculty from across the college, with colleagues from CRLT and from LS&A ISS, in what ways was that important for you in terms of thinking about this course? In what ways was that a beneficial program to participate in?
Well, it was fundamental for me in getting me beyond this fancy $10 million classroom is a nifty way to do reporting out of group work, and into thinking team-based learning is actually a completely different way of teaching. Oh, I'm going to have to flip my classroom, but that's going to be worth it. So that already was part of my fundamental process in moving away from looking at the classroom and team-based learning in a narrow instrumental way and thinking this is a whole way of learning that I need to embrace fully, and that'll bring a completely new kinds of value to my classroom and my students' experience. Then you guys presented, you know, in a very economic way, you presented a ton of things that you saw. I mean, I pretty much did everything you presented. I did the scratch cards, I did the framing, I did the wrappers. I always say, okay, I'm not going to do one or two, I'm going to try to do it all. I think the single most valuable moment in the Large Course Initiative workshop was the final group exercise you asked us to do, which would be to diagram out a lesson plan for one of your earlier days in the classroom. And knowing that I had to share it with my team members in the workshop, having learned ideas from them that I was going to reflect in this first lesson plan, made me think, wait a second, you know, I'm still doing this kind of inertly, kind of like here's my first content piece, here's my second content. I need to flip my lecture and think about what's the student process, how do I bring them into the space, how do I bring them into conversation with each other, how do I bring them into focus with their GSI, how then do I have them do something with those relationships. So I think I might have taken the workshop, I might have tried to do some of these things, and it might have all been kind of patchwork if I hadn't been forced within, in the space of, I think, 4 or 5 workshops,
Right.
put it in practice. How are you going to really try to make this mobile in your lesson plan? And that was really eye-opening to me, that I was going to have to rethink my whole process about lesson plans too, from much more from the point of view of what I wanted out of the team. And I just saw that, this is like a lesson plan that I've never done before, where it just keeps weaving onto itself, as opposed to going through outline points that build in some kind of an abstract sequence. So that made it very experiential for me, and it made me realize that the team-based learning is going to be highly experiential from the students, and that's the piece I wanted. I saw happen in that exercise, and we talked through with each other in our different lesson plans, and the way we could tweak those lesson plans and do them better, that I took away from. So it was, it helped that it was the last exercise, 'cause that's the part I took away. But that was the moment where everything crystallized for me, and I thought, okay, this is going to be really different than anything I've done before as a teacher. It might involve some skill sets I've developed beforehand, but the end result is not a sum of those skill sets. It's a completely new thing.
If I could follow up as well, I think one of the things that I really appreciated is that you had mentioned a very succinct collection of resources. So I think that just having that, here's the 2 best articles we could find on X, and so making you as a participant feel like You're filling in the blanks a little bit, but it's not overwhelming. And all of that stuff has been sort of curated so that you're really getting the best of the best. That component, along with really lovely dinners together, because that's the format of it, which leads to this real sense of community and risk taking, and these small activities that had the potential to really make you take these concepts out for a spin, if you will, but not overwhelming and doable from a time standpoint. I've had many faculty say to me, it was wonderful. It was 4 sessions, but it made me carve out time. And it's a resource that I can keep going back to because you have them nicely organized on a Canvas site. So kudos.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that the experimentation that you did this past year with this course, and also, I think the iterative nature of this across these various conversations, and so the work that you did to implement Perusal in your course, which we then brought in as something for folks to work directly with as part of this iteration of the large course initiative, was just a way in which I think these being in this community to converse about teaching and learning helps build things over time, which is a really wonderful thing.
It keeps it fresh. It keeps it current. It keeps it based in real teaching spaces with real instructors and real students and real lessons learned.
Absolutely.
I'll admit that I'm kind of a lone wolf in my work. And in our teaching, we're kind of in silos. We never even talk to our colleagues about our teaching. Never.
Right.
And I haven't had a lot of experience of being a team member and working on teams, and it's a very foreign experience to me. And this was kind of my introduction to team-based learning as my own. And I definitely got the point that the more heads you've got to put together around a problem, the better the ideas and the sourcing of different tools gets. But I'm still in my own process of learning how to surrender some control.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that you commiserated with Phil many times, particularly on Canvas issues. And Canvas, I think, particularly for the DBL setting, you had mentioned things like the ability for quizzes to be auto-graded, and so different things like understanding checks that kick off each session. That it's a tool with a lot of potential. Can you fill us in on some of those? Even the moments of frustration. What were the tough spots?
More than the tough spots, I really just love that it was. You've been talking about how your students built these communities and everything happened organically. And then that got blown up, and I heard the exact same pattern for your team-based learning workshops, which was really nice. And so talking about the dinners sounds a lot like forcing the slow readings onto your students.
It's true.
So modeling that, Philomena Meekin from the Language Resource Center and I sat down with George and had some brainstorms about it, right? And then as you got into the nitty-gritty of how do I do question banks in Canvas? What is that?
Interesting.
Why do I care about question banks? And things like this. That was my small role in helping you actualize your team-based learning courses, I think. And so then having my role was to sort of sit down and help you work through the process yourself, right? For certain things, much like the GSIs for your students, sit down and help them work through what does the instructor mean by this essay prompt or what have you. So, yeah.
I wouldn't call that a small role. Canvas, when you do a flipped classroom, everything has to go through Canvas, even if you're using outside platforms, and none of it is very intuitive on Canvas. The fact that the student's experience of Canvas is different than the instructor's experience. It took me a while to realize I could see the student view. So you have to keep coming in at Canvas different ways to understand. C tools, everybody saw the same thing. It was pretty. I know it's a very simple program, but it was intuitive in a certain way that Canvas can't be. And I have to say that taking all of this on and taking it on in a new room where in the middle of a lecture the sound would go out and I was stuck without a lesson plan and I had to improvise something. Having pushback from the GSIs that I hadn't thought through at a time because I didn't foresee it. Having issues with the students based around my quizzes or writing prompts. It was overwhelmingly stressful on many different levels. It was the physically most challenging thing I've done as an academic.
Wow.
And I know you don't like to be used this way, but having somebody to just have a meltdown
Yes.
with, even if it was a meltdown over email, you got one of my meltdowns too.
That's fine.
That's good.
I just, at some points, I just needed to just
Yeah.
cry. It was
Yeah.
really,
It was
really
tough.
difficult. Yeah.
That's what team-based learning initiatives are about, though. It's like having that
Crying?
community.
Oh.
Well, yeah,
Yeah,
because that's
but
what
the
students
community.
do. And
The
that's, I
community.
think, like you said, your groups happened organically. But that's part of the way it works, is that they can have those like very human sort of like, I can't do this moments.
Yeah. Push through.
And then like everyone moves forward together. So like,
I think it was one
very
of the motivations for us to have this interview was I think it's really hard for people on campus sometimes to figure out where to get support and how it all fits together. And so I think the overall lesson from that is it's through seminars, it's through long time relationships,
Yes.
that it all comes together.
Yeah. So I'd known Philomena and you through the LRC, and I knew both of you to be kind of, these are people I can go to in an emergency.
Yep.
And I met you and Whitney through the workshop, and then through the TBL things, I met you, Carla, and then Nicole through CADME. And so I put you all on my syllabus as design consultants.
Yes,
for,
you did. You did.
and I really felt
appreciate that.
it was really part of my teaching team. It wasn't just simply the sourcing of ideas, but the sense that there were people I could go to get help, and I did get help from, but just the knowledge that I wasn't alone.
Right.
I couldn't have taken all this on
Yeah.
if I'd been like in the past where you don't have my old institution where you didn't have this kind of support. I probably would be in an asylum at this point.
glad you're not.
Very good. We're glad you know. Well, I want to thank each and every one of you, Deb and George and Phil, for sharing your thoughts, for giving the time to this at the end of a hectic semester. I know it's hard, but we're hoping that this is a good resource for people who are interested in having experiences like the LCI or teaching in an unusual space, or maybe even just trying out something new in Canvas. So we really appreciate you joining us today.